So my name is IRZAK, and I run an organization called Frost Methane Labs, and we find concentrated, continuous, unregulated sources of methane and install devices to mitigate them.
What's your background? What led you to this line of work that you're doing?
So I'm a computer scientist by training, and I worked on distributed systems until at some point I read a 4-page article from Scientific American on ocean acidification. And after that, kind of the rest of my career, so to date, has been in a variety of areas in climate change. So first the electric grid, but even when I was in that, I always looked at what problems are out there, or wait, can I backwalk this? Excellent. So ever since I started working on that, I've always been looking at what is the size of a sub-problem, because climate change is the size of like the whole economy. So what are sub-parts of where emissions are coming from? And then how many people are working on which ones of these problems? And so ever since I started working on it, methane has always felt like it was underinvested in. And so even back when I was at Google, I tried starting a methane project. And then when I left and saw that there were these exploding hills in Siberia that were being discovered recently, that's when, I really started this project.
Okay, and more specifically, what led you to the work that you're doing in terms of flaring? How did you come to that decision?
Well, that one is pretty easy. So methane is 28 times more heat trapping than CO2 over a 100-year time frame, kind of including its half-life, decomposition in the atmosphere, and just burning it is basically the cheapest mitigation you can imagine, because it turns one molecule of methane to one molecule of CO2, and it ends up decomposing in the atmosphere to that one molecule of CO2. Eventually, we just take away all of the warming that it produces in the meantime. And it's extremely low cost, and it is reasonably, compared to some of the other solutions, it is reasonably easy to do in a very robust way. And so really I think how cheaply we can mitigate this really, really matters. And so I've always been focused on finding the lowest cost solutions, and this really kind of hit the sweet spot.
As far as, just setting fire to methane, people cook with it. So I guess that's kind of flaring in its own way.
Absolutely.
What's different about what it is that you do? What's the unique aspect of it?
So we take methane that otherwise would have made it out into the atmosphere, right? So it's coming through cracks in the ground, it's coming through lakes, it's coming through old water wells. So this is methane that is not economical for oil and gas companies to capture. If it is, fantastic, right? Putting it in the pipeline is always better than setting it on fire without a productive use, but often it's not possible, right? Because the pipeline is too far, the quantities are too small. And so what we do is we build these devices that set it on fire, but the methane that's coming out from our sources is pretty different than what's coming out of your stove. It's still methane, but it's methane that comes with nitrogen and CO2 and sulfur. It's not coming out pure, and it's coming sometimes at variable flow rates. So one day it could be coming out quite a bit, and another day maybe a lot less. So our device needs to be able to handle the variety of flow rates and the variety of gas compositions that come out naturally.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about the system, how you developed it, and what stage it's at?
Well, if by you mean the Frost Methane team.
Sorry, I was waiting until you put the cap down.
Oh, yeah. Well, if by you mean the Frost Methane team, I am a software engineer. All of the brilliant mechanical and electrical things were done by some of the wonderful engineers we work with. So Elizabeth Hillstrom, Lachlan Barker, Edwin Chu, Ethan Chaliff were the ones that really came up with the system. And so there's 3 separate parts to the system. One part is making sure that we achieve complete combustion under a variety of flow rates and gas compositions, right? So that's kind of the mechanical part. There's the electronics part, which is measuring it to the standards that carbon markets require, which are very, very high. So how do we reduce the cost of this kind of a system? And similarly with the mechanical part, also the name of the game for us is how do we make it really, really low cost, right? There's definitely all sorts of really fancy flares that exist out there, but they're pretty expensive and often much larger than the kind of smaller modular, you can like hike in with it kind of systems that we're deploying. And then the third part is, well, how do you get the methane into the device in the first place? And in some cases, there's a rusty pipe in the ground from old coal mine development from 30 years ago that we can connect to. But in other cases, like our installation in the Arctic, there's some incredibly clever things that the team came up with to get the methane from, you know, this bubbling, like jacuzzi-looking thing in the middle of the lake to having it, you know, funneled into our device with its own pressure, so that we don't need to have a pump or anything energy-consuming on there. And then in the Arctic, of course, there's a big challenge around both the different ranges of temperatures and the fact that power is not always available.
What are the, because your funding model, I guess, would rely on the credit system. Mm-hmm. Are you able to work with non-anthropogenic sources and still benefit from that? Or is there an incentive for people to support you in that?
Yeah, I mean, the atmosphere doesn't care where the methane comes from, and we don't either. So for example, like reforestation is, you know, a famous kind of carbon credit. And so destroying natural methane is not really, you know, conceptually any different. But the, you know, the goal is, of course, to reduce the amount of methane in the atmosphere, and we should do it from the sources that are the cheapest. And if that's anthropogenic, that's great. And if it's natural, that's also great. But the important part is that these sources aren't currently covered by any regulation. So there's no other reasons why they would be mitigated, and they are not profitable to develop to natural gas extraction otherwise.
There isn't at the moment a methane market, is there? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, so carbon credits do include methane-related, what's called methodologies, right? So a methodology is kind of, you know, per source of methane. But those are pretty common. There's methodologies for coal mine methane, for manure pond methane, for rice methane, for landfill methane in places where those landfills aren't regulated. And, you know, you multiply methane as 28 times more potent than CO2. But if you burn it, you, of course, produce one molecule of CO2, which is quite a bit heavier, and this is measured by tons rather than by moles. Maybe that doesn't matter, but essentially you get a 25x multiplier, and then you subtract your whole footprint from that, right? So you use electricity. Well, how clean is the electricity you use, for example? But yeah, methane, nitrous oxide, HFCs, carbon markets encompass basically all greenhouse gases. So there isn't like a methane specific, but there isn't a nitrous oxide specific either.
What's your plan going forward? Are you looking at going to scale? Are you looking at kind of basically multiplying the structure that you have?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're, you know, we think we picked a good unit, right? This is modular and kind of easy to install, easy to transport. And so as we, you know, get larger sources, we can put 2 of them or 3 of them on, right? So we do think that the unit size is quite good for most of the sources that we looked at. If it gets really big, then we can always adapt oil and gas equipment, right? There are other producers for the larger stuff. And right now, our goal going forward is to install it on as many sources as possible, and ideally of different sorts as well. And so, yeah, the impact is how many of these devices we have out there.
What's the response been to your offering, and who's shown the most interest?
Well, so on the selling side, we go into California cap and trade, and so that's much more of a commodity market than like the voluntary carbon offset markets, where they're in the voluntary carbon offset markets, there's more distinctions between the different types, while as in the California, only 7 offset types are allowed, and a lot of the buyers really just want a mix of those so that their risk is spread out. Right, so on the compliance side, it's reasonably easy on the risk side, and then our offering to the landowners is that, we share the revenue streams with them, right? And so we've been very happy working with our land and mineral rights partners.
Let's talk about, I'm just going to change the file.
Sure. I like it. Is this even in English?
So, let's just talk about climate restoration in itself as a subject, and obviously we need reduction, but it's not really going to cut it on its own, it seems. Can you just give us your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, depends. Because we can reduce some of these natural sources potentially as well. Very much, I don't think this is going to happen in my lifetime, but in theory, we could actually reduce the emissions to below their, pre-civilization levels. Okay, wait, that wasn't very articulate. Let me try this again.
Okay.
Right. So I do think that with methane, because it's got a reasonably short half-life in the atmosphere, if today we cut all anthropogenic emissions to zero, from a methane standpoint, we'll be back to prehistoric levels reasonably quickly, right? So I do think that reduction, if we go to zero today, that would be sufficient. Of course, we're not that likely to go to zero today. And so one of the things that we're targeting, and this is going to be a very small slice of the solution, is some of these natural sources that we talked about earlier, where some of them, maybe not the permafrost, but definitely some other sources that we're looking at, have been always emitting. And so if we reduce those, that can compensate a little bit for the fact that we don't reduce 100% of the anthropogenic emissions. But that's not quite what you were asking, was it?
No, it's kind of, that's certainly usable. What are your personal thoughts about where we are right now and where we're heading and what our chances are?
Methane specifically, or?
Climate, to then go into the methane, but just in general with the way the climate's going. And
I mean, so I'm a diehard optimist. Obviously there will be people affected, and those people are probably the ones that didn't cause it and that have the least ability to adapt. So I think that that's unfair, and I think that there will also be, from human activities, not just climate change necessarily, right? I think deforestation-wise, we're making more species extinct faster than even with climate. So, I think that in general, human impact on nature is quite profound. But I've been working on this for about 11 years, and I have to say that the amount of talent going into this kind of work, into emission reduction and in general human impact on the environment reduction, the number of people going into it is enormous, and has the last 3 years have been a huge uptick, right? So 10 years ago or 11 years ago when I started working in this, there really weren't that many of us that were working on this kind of a challenge. But now it's the amount of money, the amount of talent, the kind of policies that we're seeing, that moved faster than I thought it would. So maybe I didn't have, in general, very high expectations, but I have to say, it's been exceeding them.
Okay, that's great. I've got a few more questions. I want to see. So, governance and questions around, kind of compliance, and we've got scientists, we've got policymakers, and then we've got entrepreneurs, and then the question of funding. Where's the money going to come to fund a lot of these restoration projects? And then it kind of falls into the realm of innovators that have to come up with solutions as well. Otherwise, we're just going to be talking about it forever. Mm-hmm. So it raises a lot of kind of moral challenges and questions. What are your reflections on that?
Well, so quick clarification, right? There's the moral questions, and then there's where is funding kind of currently coming from? Should I answer either, both?
Yeah,
I'm a little bit more hesitant to talk about the moral aspects of it, because where does that line up with in our list of priorities with some of the suffering that there is in the developing world in general, right? Like I kind of have a hard time making moral decisions for other people, right? And
I guess
government taxes are kind of like other people's like moral decisions, so I have a pretty hard time with that. But I know I know where this falls on my list of priorities, and so, basically like fighting to start this and like taking huge salary cuts. I don't know if we really want to say that because maybe people will not want to work in climate because of that. But anyhow, but yeah, I think kind of, I just like, I will never dictate other people's morals, right? I can dictate what I do with my time and with my money. And with my time and with my money, for the last 10 years, like this is the solution space that I choose to like pour everything into. But I don't have a strong comment, I think, on other people's,
what about the rush to develop technology where, a lot of people are saying, we've got to slow this down, and other people are saying that we do, but we don't have time.
We have to what?
People are saying we've got to be more cautious in terms of experimentation and rollout, and other people also in the scientific community are saying that we're running out of time.
Well, I guess it's a question of what we're talking about, right? There are things that are pretty much no-brainers, right? There are things around energy efficiency, which are just win-wins for everybody, right? So those things, long trusted solutions. There's some market frictions around that. Sometimes the owner of a building is different than the renter of a building, but I think that there are kind of a bunch of solutions there around that, right? There's solutions around what kind of heating and cooling systems you use. So there's kind of like a wide thing there that is tested and just needs to get deployed. And I think that's part of what the IRA was trying to do, although it does kind of a pretty wide variety of things. And then I think that there's, solutions like ours, I don't think that there's any real danger there, right? So as far as like, do we have time or do we not have time? It's like, well, this is a reasonably proven solution, right? Like we know how methane converts into CO2, and we know all of the like trace gases in our stream. So that type of thing really feels pretty safe, right? Like reforestation with native species, that feels like a pretty safe solution. So I think it's really only a minority of solution that debate of do we have time or do we not have time. I'm probably on the more cautious side of my community on that. Like if we're talking about like spraying other things in the atmosphere, I think we should do the science. I don't think we should deploy without doing the science. I think there's like, okay, I lost my articulateness. But anyways, I think we should do the science. I don't think we should spray crap in the atmosphere and hope for the best.
So part of all of this is about science, but part of all of this is just about human nature and behavior. And we, once you give a bunch of humans something, it's really hard to take it away from them. This subtractive process is very difficult. What are your thoughts on society's ability to kind of navigate this? Do you think we've got the ability to do that?
I think in the long term, we don't need to be taking anything away from anybody, right? People are talking about, long distance flight. That's going to be the hardest thing to decarbonize. And today there is, several companies working on electric long distance aviation without assuming any magical new technology, right? So everything, like you name it, right? There seems to be at least a handful of innovators working on the solutions to keep our quality of life today while still, preserving the environment. So I really think that there is, like, name a problem, and there's probably an innovator out there that is making it work. Oh, and those companies, not only are they saying that they can make long distance electric flight work at all, they can make it be cheaper than today's flights, right? So I think that there's just a lot of work that needs to happen to bring down a bunch of the cleaner technologies down the cost curve so that they can be competitive, right? And some of it is about the pure innovation in the lab, and a bunch of it is about deployment at some scale, right? Like we saw what happened to solar panels once they got deployed and scale. We're seeing right now with superconducting tape. There's now been demand for it, and the price has dropped by 10x. So I think that these things, like we're still in the infancy of a lot of the technology curves, and it would be very exciting to see which ones come down. But I don't think we should assume that anything needs to get taken away rather than replaced.
That's great.
So my name is IRZAK, and I'm the CEO of Frost Methane. And Frost Methane finds continuous, concentrated, and unregulated sources of methane, whether they're anthropogenic or natural. And we install devices on that measure the methane very precisely and then mitigate it through burning. So through converting 1 molecule of methane to 1 molecule of CO2 and 2 molecules of water.